Good morning. I'm Sienna Dode. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brunswick, and I'd like to welcome you this morning. Our interim minister, Justine Sullivan, will be speaking today about a trip she took through UUSC. It's entitled Remembering El Salvador. Our charity for soul is the Tedford Shelter. Again, let me welcome you today. I hope you enjoy the service.
Good morning, beloveds of UUCB, and welcome to this August worship service. It is good to be with you. Back when I first imagined sharing this worship service with you, the world had begun to open up a bit. Dale and I took some time together in July and we traveled to Washington, D.C. Kind of a hot and sticky time to be in D.C., but that's when ministers have time off. So we took the train, and things were just starting to open up, and we walked around to the various monuments. And I realized as we were there that it felt like a reclaiming of that space that had been so contaminated by the insurrection of January 6th. And so it was good, even on that hot, sticky few days in July, to be there, to see those monuments, to stand at the Lincoln Monument and read the words of the Gettysburg Address, words that could have been written yesterday, words that still bring a tear to my eye. And I must tell you, my friends, I was not the only one wiping away tears reading those words by President Lincoln. So it was a good trip to make, and I thought about sharing with you the stories from a trip that I made in January of 2020 to El Salvador. This was with our Unitarian Universalist Service Committee and the College for Social Justice. And just to remind you, in January of 2020, when we went to El Salvador, the big news story was the impeachment. That was the first impeachment of the former President of the United States. And as we followed the news from the world, we were hearing faint murmurings of a strange flu-like virus that had been emerging in China. But we knew that, of course, we in the United States would be safe from harm. We never could have imagined that in just a month or so, life as we knew it would have changed. And so my time in El Salvador kind of got swallowed up in all that happened afterwards. But I wanted to share with you some of the pictures and stories from that trip. So that is the focus of this morning's worship, my travels to El Salvador in January of 2020. And each morning, those of us gathered together would have a brief worship service, and we shared various readings, and one of my favorites was this piece by the Reverend Angela Herrera called Prayer for Travelers. This is a prayer for all the travelers, for the ones who start out in beauty, who fall from grace, who step gingerly looking for the way back, and for those who are born into the margins, who travel from one liminal space to another, crossing boundaries in search of center. This is a prayer for the ones whose births are a passing from darkness to darkness, who all their lives are drawn toward the light and keep moving, and for those whose journeys are a winding road that begins and ends in the same place. Though only when the journey is completed do they finally know where they are. For all the travelers, young and old, aching and joyful, weary and full of life, the ones who are here and the ones who are not here, the ones who are like you and they're all like you, and the ones who are different, for in some ways we each travel alone. This is a prayer for traveling mercies and sure-footedness, for clear vision, for bread, for your body and spirit, for water, for your safe arrival, and for everyone you see along the way. Come, let us be together in worship, and let us sing together our opening song, hymn number 318, We Would Be One.
Hello and good morning. My name is Tobin and I serve as your Director of Religious Exploration. Today's Time for All Ages story lifts up our 7th principle and talks about how we are all interconnected. I hope you enjoy. All I See is Part of Me by Cara M. Curtis, with illustrations by Cynthia Aldridge. The author dedicates this book to the child within us all. I am part of all I see, and all I see is part of me. I am my hands. I am my feet. I am the puppy across the street. I am the moon. I am the stars. I'm even found in candy bars. I used to think that I was small, a little body, that was all. But then one day I asked the sun, "Who are you?" He beamed, "We are one." But Mr. Sun, how is this true? Am I not me? Are you not you? He smiled. You might ask Sister Star. She too is part of who you are. And so I waited till the night, when darkness let me see her light. Sister Star, how can it be that I am you and you are me? She glowed. You're larger than you know. You're every place there is to go. You have a body, this is true, but look at what's inside of you. I closed my eyes to see within. I saw a light. It made me grin. It reminded me of Sister Star. She said, "That light is who you are. Your body is just a part of the light that shines within your heart." In all the world, in all of space, your light shines bright. It's every place. And when you join it dot to dot, you'll see that you are what you've got. All the plants, the animals, and trees are in your light, and you are these. Look inside each one you meet and see your light. It's so complete. Inside, outside, below, above, see your light and feel its love. You're asking you when you ask me, because we're one, don't you agree? I looked again at all my light and saw that Sister Star was right. For every question there can be, an answer waits inside of me. Then I said, there's even more. Each question opens up a door, and every door that I walk through leads to a part of me that's new. Thank you so much, Sister Star. I love the part of me you are. I wondered as I climbed in bed, does all of me sleep when I rest my head? And then a voice called through the night, "Oh, you precious child of light. Even when you sleep, you are awake in every shining star." I snuggled with my teddy bear, and in his light I saw me there. You are me and I am you. You love me and I love you too. I closed my eyes and found my light, dancing with the moonbeams in the night. I said a prayer I know was heard, 'cause all I am hears every word. And I can see in all of me that there can be no end.
Fuente de amor, ven hacia mí y al corazón, cántale tu compasión, sopla a volar, sube la
Our reading this morning is by Ruben Alves. What is hope? It is a presentiment that imagination is more real and reality less real than it looks. It is a hunch that the overwhelming brutality of facts that oppress and repress is not the last word. It is a suspicion that reality is more complex than realism wants us to believe, and that the frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual, and that in a miraculous and unexpected way, life is preparing the creative events which will open the way to freedom and resurrection. The two, suffering and hope, live from each other. Suffering without hope produces resentment and despair. Hope without suffering creates illusions, naivete, and drunkenness. Let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. This is the secret discipline. It is a refusal to let the creative act be dissolved in immediate sense experience, and a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. Such disciplined love is what has given prophets, revolutionaries, and saints the courage to die for the future they envisaged. They make their own bodies the seed of their highest hope. Here ends our reading.
When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we all were beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we all and beautiful. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we all and beautiful. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we all and beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can't no one be well? But I dreamt we all were beautiful and strong.
I ended up there somewhat by accident. I had applied to be part of a border trip to Tucson, Arizona, scheduled for October of 2019. That trip was canceled, but I was asked if I would like to go to El Salvador instead. I hesitated. It was further away. It seemed more dangerous. And frankly, I wondered about my own comfort. The trip to Tucson, we would be staying in the United States and we would travel into the desert. We might cross the border into Mexico, but we would sleep each night in the comfort of our U.S. hotel. This was a trip to El Salvador. And I worried about how we would be seen. What would our presence as visitors from the U.S., how would that be understood? Would we be welcomed? The U.S. government had played an active role in the dirty war in El Salvador in the 1980s, which pitted a right-wing government against Marxist guerrillas. The United States sent military advisors to help the Salvadoran military fight its dirty war, and it sent hundreds of millions of dollars in economic and military aid. In El Salvador, more than 75,000 people lost their lives during the Civil War, which lasted from 1980 until the 1992 peace agreement. Think about that, 75,000 people in a country of about 3.5 million. The Marxist guerrillas committed atrocities, it is true, but the United Nations Truth Commission, established as part of the peace accord, found that more than 85% of the killings, kidnappings, and torture had been the work of government forces, which included paramilitaries, death squads, and army units trained by the United States. Not only was the United States silent in the face of human rights abuses in El Salvador, the State Department and White House often sought to cover up the brutality to protect the perpetrators of even the most heinous crimes. In March of 1980, the beloved Archbishop Oscar Romero was murdered. Although originally something of a centrist, Oscar Romero was radicalized by the indiscriminate violence he saw that the campesinos, his congregants, faced. Oscar Romero became a voice for the poor and repressed, and in his final Sunday sermon, he issued a plea to the country's military junta. He said, "In the name of God, in the name of this suffering people whose cries rise to heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, in the name of God, stop the repression." The next day, he was cut down by a single bullet while he was saying Mass. In 2018, Romero was canonized as a Catholic saint, and this is a point of great pride for the Salvadoran people. So I worried about all of that, about the role of the U.S. government in the suffering of the Salvadoran people, and I was uneasy about going. The Unitarian Universalist Service Committee and the College of Social Justice sponsored trips to places where there have been human rights violations or where there are ongoing social justice issues. They have traveled to Honduras and Guatemala, to Nicaragua, but this was the first trip to El Salvador. The UUSC forms partnerships with local organizations and brings religious professionals from the U.S., and our group was mostly UU, but there were some Methodists and Episcopalians. Both of those churches have long-standing relationships with social activists in El Salvador. We were there as the guests of a local organization called Cristo Sal. Cristo Sal provides advocacy, accompaniment, emergency relocation for people dealing with violence, usually from gangs, which are rampant in El Salvador. They also have a legal group that takes cases that are likely to go before the Supreme Court and may possibly have an impact nationwide. And they also have a school, La Escuela Global, where they teach religious professionals from the U.S. alongside of local Salvadoran religious leaders and social activists. And that turned out to be one of the great gifts of this trip, learning about the issues facing Salvadorans and the work they are doing alongside of Salvadorans. The trainings were held in Spanish and English with simultaneous translation offered throughout. I am very impressed with this organization, and I left with a sense of hope for the future that such committed, talented people have chosen to stay and work for justice in their home country. The people that we were studying with have college educations and greater wealth than the vast majority of Salvadorans. They could easily leave. But these folks love their country, and so they stay to try and make things better. That is one of the things that struck me during this week that I was there. The love that people have for their country, even though they have suffered, in many cases at the hands of their own government, even though there is violence and poverty, it is home. The church is important in their daily lives. Family, extended family, is central, and this is key. For someone to take the drastic step of seeking relocation, and Cristo Sal helps people relocate when there are death threats from gangs, and this happens quite often, but for someone to take the step of leaving their community, their village, their extended family is extraordinary. And for someone to decide that there is nowhere in the country that they can be safe, and to decide to flee, to travel to the U.S., to seek asylum is almost unthinkable. And then what greets them if they arrive here? If they actually scrape up the money and make the treacherous journey and actually make it to or across the U.S. border, what happens to them then? They are separated from their families, put in detention, actually in prisons in some cases, that's where they're held, or if they stay in Mexico to await an asylum hearing, they face conditions that are completely inadequate, unsanitary, and with violence not unlike the violence they fled. It's bad, and in this time of COVID, it is certainly worse. So I arrived there on a Monday, January 20th of 2020. And this is a picture I took just outside the airport. Everywhere people are selling food, tortillas and plantains and coconuts. There is bounty. The climate is perfect for growing all kinds of food, and yet many people there are hungry because the land has been taken over to grow coffee and sugar cane, exports that make some people rich, but not the average person. So it makes sense that since food is so precious, that is what people sell. Here people might sell Air Jordans or fake Rolex watches, but in El Salvador, the street vendors are selling food. We stayed at a guest house run by a generous and lovely woman named Sonia. Her mother and aunt had run the guest house before her, and now she runs it with help from her son, who drives a cab and works around the guest house, probably has other jobs as well. There were a dozen of us from the States staying at this guest house, and about 10 Salvadorans joined us for classes, but they stayed with family or friends nearby. Sonia prepared breakfast for us each morning, and then we got on a small bus and traveled across the city to the campus of Cristo Sal. We saw armed security guards in front of many homes and businesses. We would spend the morning in class talking about definitions of violence and human rights, hearing stories of the people that Cristo Sal serves, and hearing from our 10 Salvadoran colleagues about the work that they are doing, advocating for people who have been displaced or who have been threatened with violence from gang members. Now, there were already gangs in El Salvador, but the two worst gangs that maybe you've heard of, the 18th Street Gang and the MS-13 Gang, were actually created in the United States. They're made up of Salvadorans who met while they were imprisoned in Los Angeles. Then they were deported back to El Salvador, and gang violence has increased in frequency and severity since those deportations. So once again, the U.S. made things worse. After lunch at Cristo Sal, wonderful food served in the courtyard. This was January, and we could eat our lunch outside in the courtyard. And then we'd go on field trips around the city. We traveled to a number of sites associated with Oscar Romero, places where he celebrated Mass, places he lived, the place where he died, and the place where he is buried. I was reluctant to take pictures inside of churches, so you won't see a lot of pictures from inside churches, but I can tell you that the art and the architecture were very reflective of the place. In one church, the Stations of the Cross, usually paintings or stained glass of the final hours of Jesus. In this church, the Stations of the Cross depictions of Jesus were made to look like the local campesinos, their bodies bloodied from lashings or riddled with bullets. The Salvadorans identify with the suffering of Jesus, and they depict Jesus as a brown-skinned Latino or indigenous person. Interestingly, the billboard advertisements that you see all around the city often show light-skinned people. 88% of the population of El Salvador is of mixed ancestry, European and Native American. About 12% are Spanish from Spain, and a tiny number are German or Swiss, and yet the people in the advertisements look like they could be Northern European. If they kill me, I will be resurrected in the Salvadoran people. And on the other side of this building, con este pueblo no cuesta ser un buen pastor. With this people, it is easy to be a good pastor. We spent time in this garden at the University of Central America. This is where 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter were massacred. I remember hearing about this at the time. Armed militia stormed the gates first, killing the housekeeper and her daughter. We saw the room where they died. The priest fled to the garden and no doubt heard the women being killed, knowing that the paramilitary assassins were coming for them next. I wonder if they prayed. I wonder if they heard each other's confessions, and was there time for that? There are many, many shrines to martyred civilians. So important for them is it to have these events acknowledged and remembered. We traveled to the grounds of a hospice where Oscar Romero lived for the last few years of his life. His rooms have been turned into a museum, very simple, modest rooms. Then we went to the chapel where he was killed while he was saying Mass. A brutal death. And then we went to a park. I appreciate that after something heavy, we would get to be outside, someplace beautiful. But within this park, as in so many of the parks, there is a monument to the thousands of people killed or disappeared during the years of armed conflict, roughly 1980 to 1992. Much like the Vietnam War Memorial, there are rows and rows of names arranged by the years in which they were killed or kidnapped. And I got to celebrate my birthday while I was there, and I had to take a picture of the cake. The next day, the last full day of our trip, we got up very early and drove 3 or 4 hours into the country. We were headed to El Mozote, site of one of the worst massacres in Salvadoran history. On the way, we stopped at the Museum of the Revolution. The military, the Salvadoran military, with aid from the U.S., had been engaging in what seemed like indiscriminate violence against civilians that the government believed were engaging in revolutionary discourse or actions. The U.S. was afraid of the spread of communism, though it is hard to see how farming collectives that would allow people to work the land and share in its profits would be dangerous to the American way. There had been a small group of rebels, guerrilla fighters, but after the death of Romero in 1980 and the massacre at El Mozote in 1981, more and more people began to rise up and fight back. This Museum of the Revolution chronicles that struggle, and here is where you see old posters in English from the U.S. Remember those posters, U.S. out of El Salvador? Most disturbing were the deactivated weapons made in the USA. The rebel forces would capture the weapons and then use them against the Salvadoran army. They had a radio station for the resistance, and they would keep moving the equipment around so that the government couldn't stop them from broadcasting. And then we went to El Mozote, and we met with survivors of the massacre from 1981. Over 1,000 people killed in this very small village. The men, women, and children were separated. and then all of them were killed. Only a few managed to escape, and the government denied it ever happened. The few people that escaped or who happened to be away on the day of the massacre fled, and then some years later returned. It made me think of lynchings that happened in the American South. People that survived, family members of those who were lynched, would get out of town under cover of darkness. So they not only lost the people that were killed, but generations of people who were afraid to live there. But the survivors hired anthropologists from New Zealand who discovered mass graves. Remember, the government was denying this ever happened, so they hired anthropologists from New Zealand to come and excavate these mass graves. And then the folks found legal representation, and they are still fighting all these years later, 40 years later, for acknowledgement of the massacre and for some kind of reparation. We sat in a circle with 5 or 6 survivors. One woman had lost 4 siblings and 16 cousins. Remember, they lived in these extended family networks. Another lost her entire family. And as each one introduced themselves to us, to a person, they thanked us for our presence. They understood that while the U.S. government had supported those who had killed their loved ones, the people of the U.S. were on their side. I am still overwhelmed by their grace and generosity. And when they were done speaking and we were done visiting with them, we walked through kind of a receiving line with family members and loved ones, and they embraced us. And then we set out for the place we would stay for the night. Our bus couldn't make the winding dirt roads up this mountain, so we had to ride in these open-air trucks, holding on for dear life as we traveled up these roads. And then, an oasis. I would have taken better pictures of the truck, but I was holding on. How wonderful, after such a powerful and painful day, to arrive at a place of such beauty. I am so glad I made this trip. I had read about El Salvador. I knew something of the history, especially of U.S. involvement in the armed conflict. But to be in the places, to speak with the people, hear the music, taste the food, to hear about issues of violence and corruption and the struggle for justice directly from the people involved, to experience the generosity of the Salvadoran people, to sense their commitment to truth and reconciliation, that is a gift. One that I know I will be thinking about and learning from for quite some time. And I highly recommend, when international travel is open again, if you have an opportunity to do a trip with our UU Service Committee or the College for Social Justice, I highly recommend it. On Sunday morning, before heading back to San Salvador, we had a closing worship service, the first one with all of us together. Those of us from the U.S. who were staying in the guest house would have a brief worship service every morning. But this was the first time that we were with our Salvadoran colleagues and that we could have a worship service with them. We sang in English and Spanish, and we closed with a song in Latin, root of both our languages, Ubi Caritas, and this will be our closing hymn. The words are Ubi Caritas et amor, Ubi Caritas Deus ibi est. Where there is love and charity, there will God be. Et amor, ubi caritas, Deus ibi est. Ubi caritas et amor, ubi caritas,
Deus ibi est.
And so, beloveds, let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. And let us have a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. And may we continue to work for peace and justice and love. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen. Ashe.